Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our second installment of the South Carolina Disruptors in Ag. And just like to thank everybody for joining in today. Today's program is going to focus on contingency planning. Probably not a plan that you hear a lot about from other people, but Kevin Burkett attended a seminar a couple of weeks ago, and he and I both felt like this was a topic that we needed to get in front of this audience. And so again, I'd like to welcome you here, and also want to remind everybody that we've decided to have this Disruptors talk on the third Wednesday of every month from 12 to 1. So you can go ahead and mark it on your calendars if you'd like to just know when we're going to do the next one. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Burkett. He's an extension associate on the Clemson Agribusiness team, and look forward to hearing what Kevin's going to share with us about contingency planning. Kevin?
Yeah, thank you, Scott, and glad to join the program for today. And did enjoy the presentation I saw recently and felt like it was a good topic and an important topic, and so definitely seemed appropriate for this type of webinar. So if you were on the program last week, we did a short poll question at the beginning and a short poll question at the end. So we were going to do that just real quickly here. So you should hopefully see this pop up on your screen. And it says, question 2, what is your level of knowledge on today's topic? So in general, in regard to contingency planning and short-term operational plans, you can indicate what your current level of knowledge is in relation to that. And we'll give you maybe just about a minute or so for most folks to have a chance to respond. And once you've selected an answer, the question will disappear from your screen. Y'all are probably pretty familiar with the Zoom features and Zoom polling questions at this point, and I'll kind of start going through the presentation a little bit. It looks like most folks have responded at this point. So when we talk about contingency planning, contingency is defined as a future event or circumstance that is possible but could not be predicted with certainty. So this could be some kind of major event, such as a natural disaster. Certainly weather is hard to predict, or especially some of those major events, until generally very short time frame before they actually happen. So we don't know, 2 years from now, what kind of disasters and things that might occur. Or they could be more of a small scale, such as employee actions or relationships. So if a employee theft, what's the risk involved with that? And when we talk about contingency planning, we're trying to understand maybe risks related to the business. And so is a natural disaster a risk? Yes, it can be, and especially depending on your location and your geography and climate and all those kinds of things. And is there a risk of, employee theft if we run a business and have employees? Yes, there might be some risk related to that as well. So for our particular operation, is trying to figure out what are potential areas of risk and prioritizing those. So someone that has access to a little bit of money related to the business, is that something that's going to have a significant impact on our business in comparison to a natural disaster that it could be infrequent as far as how often it occurs, but it could have a huge impact, for instance. So identifying those risks, but then saying, well, what is the impact of some of these things as well? So prioritizing them. And what can we do to develop contingency plans related to that? So if a natural disaster does occur, we don't know maybe exactly what's going to take place and how we might be affected, but having some kind of a plan B to say, how would we handle that situation? And again, these can be large events, they could be smaller events. and then maintaining that plan. So what we develop today and what we understand as risk today could change a year from now. And then 5 years, our risks and our tolerance for those risks, our plan for those risks could be totally different than what we might think of today. So identifying, prioritizing, kind of developing those plans, and then kind of keeping those updated for our current operation, our current business model, and all those kinds of things. So that's kind of contingency planning in a nutshell. And we're going to talk on a specific point in relation to contingency planning and risk. Scott, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add in relation to that.
Sure, Kevin. The title contingency is a little dry. When I first learned about contingency plans, the speaker called them drop dead plans. And that's a little shocking. But the point he was making in that conversation was that what happens if that key manager, key person in your business were to drop dead one day? And how would that impact the day-to-day operations of your business? And recently, just this winter, I had a client that I work with, his bookkeeper passed away late January, early February. And if a contingency plan had been available, it certainly would have made it easier getting information to the tax preparer, getting payroll done the next week. Just a lot of the day-to-day things that you don't really think about in some of your other planning mechanisms. So the contingency plan is, like Kevin said, that short-term operating. How do we deal with the next day, the next week, when something unfortunate happens?
Yeah, and very similarly have heard of scenarios, and in that case, it was maybe the bookkeeper or the tax preparer that they had to come up with a plan B for how they were going to handle that situation. And we were kind of thinking internally for the farm business, what happens if a key member of the farm is unavailable for some reason? What is the risk associated with that? And would we have a plan in place, and who can kind of step into that role, or how can we take care of some of those tasks and things that that person is responsible for in the short term? And so this is a go-to tool if something were to happen. And obviously there are different scenarios where that might be the case. It could be an accident on the farm or off the farm, some kind of sickness, illness, or even potentially, certainly people pass away, unfortunately, at unexpected times. And it could be, even not quite as dire situation, but someone is out of town for whatever reason. And it could be they have to take care of someone in their family that had an accident or is sick or something along those lines. But even if they're out of town for a conference or for business purposes, if they're off the farm and absent from the farm, this information may be useful and may be critical to continuing the day-to-day operation. So maybe a first step in trying to understand and compile this information is talking to a lot of folks that are involved with the business. And this can be employees, this can be business partners, potentially lawyers and advisors to the farm, and certainly family members if they are going to be involved or have to step in some way in those scenarios. And so maybe simply going to them and asking questions of, well, what would you need to know in order to continue the operation of the business? And it might bring up issues that were not previously realized. So in going to talk to different employees, you may understand that, really they've got a lot that they're doing. They are responsible for a lot. Their role is pretty big on the farm. And it might be advantageous for us to have 2 or 3 people that understand that and are able to help in that way, so that if that scenario were to occur, then we would have more than just that one person that is capable of handling that information or handling that task. So, the first step might be just going and having conversations with all those different folks that might be involved and help with your business. And so you would ask kind of what do they need to know and what is important in relation to that? What task would need to be handled? What important relationships are there out there that and folks that they might have to deal with and contact during this process? Certainly accounts and logins for, it could be as simple as a social media account all the way up to something like a bank account that's more critical information. Certain business information and in relation to possibly employees and when they are to be paid, how they are to be paid. Is that something that goes through an approval process each time? Is it something that's automated? When are taxes due? What are your tax responsibilities? Some of those items, and even personal details. So if someone does pass away, do we have information on hand that would help us understand and kind of get through and manage that situation as well? So this is just a quick screenshot, an example of one of the resources that we were going to mention, and we have several. We're going to get that information to you towards the end of the presentation today, but this is the Purdue Code Red worksheet, and I think one of their first pages is just basic personal information. So just in this case, we're assuming, for instance, that the farm manager, and it could be yourself, it could be someone else, but we're assuming that for some reason they are absent from the farm, and it could be any of those scenarios, an accident, maybe they pass away, something like that, but having a listing of this personal information. So social media, contacts, power of attorneys, documents, possible medical conditions that are important to know about, or even possibly final arrangements. So just kind of a quick example, and this is continuation of the Purdue Code Red sheet. So it says where to find important personal documents. And so that first, use this worksheet for help to locate the documents you will need in meeting with professional advisors. So it's got things like birth certificates, even Social Security cards, power of attorneys, wills and testaments, possibly cemetery deeds, and even location of safety deposit boxes and things like that. So that's on the personal side. And then it moves into more of the farm and business information. So what is the structure of the business? Some information related to the finances. What are important documents? Could be formation documents. It could be business meetings. But what is the location of those things? Certainly important contacts, inventory. Again, we mentioned kind of employee information. So if they need to be paid every 2 weeks, what is the process for doing that? Or could be even some of your employees have something like an allergy, shellfish, or a bee allergy or something like that. Well, it could be important for us to understand and know that. And a continuation of the farm business section. So this is just listing like bank contacts, loan officers, insurance agents. So, where are they located? What's their phone, email, all those kinds of things. If we either rent land to someone or rent from someone, who are those people? What is our agreement with them? And even contacts like extension, farm service agency, and others that we might deal with in managing the farm. So as we've mentioned, it is for a short-term scenario. So this could be a period of a couple days, possibly up to a couple weeks or even a couple months. But it should not necessarily replace business succession or business planning, which is, a succession plan is more like we want to transition the farm to the next generation, and we're going to do that over the course of the next 2 years. And so a lot of the information and the roles and the responsibilities and contacts and things that we talk about with this plan, that is affecting, say, our succession planning. But having a smooth transition and having a plan in place for, okay, over the next 6 months, these are how those things are going to be transferred. That is still something that you want to do, because having just this short-term information on hand, it would be a pretty abrupt change, a pretty abrupt event for the business to have to transition in that way. So we want you to think both short-term and long-term from that perspective. So we mentioned the Code Red document earlier, and that is the URL for that resource. It is an Excel workbook, and you can also request thumb drives from them. I think those are still available. And so you fill it out through Excel, and it can be shared that way. Again, we are going to share this with you at the end. I know looking at that link is not that helpful, so we will send that through chat, and/or we even have your email addresses from registration. We will follow up with you and get that information to you. But so the Code Red is an Excel workbook. You can also have it and share it through thumb drives. The one that I saw recently was from University of Missouri, and it's a very, very similar document, very similar goal, which is, documenting this information so that others involved with the business, if they need it, it would be a great resource to them. So Missouri's is a PDF, and that's more something that you would print out and then probably fill out by hand. And they also worked with the University of Minnesota with their AgPlan website, which you may or may not be familiar with that, but it is a business planning website specifically for farms and agribusinesses, and it is free to use. You just need an email and a login. But now under their site, once you've logged in, they have a section for a short-term operational plan, and it's very similar to the University of Missouri document, but just an online version of that. So a couple different options. You have something that's on the computer, but not necessarily online. You have something that's more physical, that if you're more comfortable doing it that way, you can use that. And then AgPlan is more in the cloud, and it's kind of totally online based, even though I think for each of these, you can print them off and that sort of thing too. And that's kind of something we'll talk about in a little bit. But for the plan, you want to communicate, you have that initial conversation of what's important to list. And then once that information is there, communicate that, share copies, and indicate to folks what is listed in the plan. Definitely communicate where those plans are located. So it's going to be good to have several copies of that. So that way, if some event does occur, that the people that need it will be able to get their hands on it. And it can be continually refined and used to start other conversations. So once that plan is developed, you might say, and it has been out and people are able to look at it and review it, it might spur them on to some other areas to say, I didn't realize this, but there might be something else that I would need to know in relation to an emergency type event. So it's a living document. It can continually be refined and updated, and like I said, maybe used to start other conversations in relation to business and succession planning and other operations of the business. And it can be a resource really for anyone on the farm, including yourself. So I know for myself, I've got probably at least 20 websites that I have to go and log into with an account and a password and that kind of thing. Well, having a sort of central file somewhere where I can easily locate and access that, that just makes it a little bit easier, because I've got it all written down and I can kind of continually use that as a resource. But also, let's say you do manage others, or you're in partnership with a couple other folks, again, if they are out of the business for whatever reason, understanding their tasks and their roles and the different people that they might work with would be a great resource for you. But not just on the farm, because we can share this information with others off the farm as well. And it definitely depends on your comfort level. It depends on your relationship with these folks and what they might be tasked with handling in relation to the farm. But even sharing some of the plan with an accountant, a lawyer, you might have a really good relationship with your neighbor and feel like they could help out in an emergency scenario. So even sharing parts of the plan with them. So you can decide what you want to list, and just because it's all listed in the plan doesn't mean you have to share everything either. So you may end up with a 10-page document, but only 2 or 3 pages are what ends up going to your accountant, or 2 or 3 pages is what you share with your neighbor. So it's all at the discretion of yourself or whoever is managing the farm. I would say in general, expect to spend a little bit of time developing these plans, because again, having those conversations, finding out what's important, kind of compiling that information, and then actually going through and documenting it through the plan, it will take a little bit of time, and it's not necessarily difficult to do, but it will take maybe a little bit of time. And then once the plan is developed, getting it out into the hands of the people that need it, making sure you have copies, and that sort of thing. So once it's developed, I mean, the time you spent will hopefully be kind of a curve in that there might be some initial time to develop the plan, but once it's out there, it's much quicker to go back and look at it and review and update for a couple things once you kind of have a plan developed. But I think that is an important point to make, in that, bad or outdated information, if someone were to go find a plan, but it's say 10 years old and a lot of the stuff doesn't apply anymore, that might send them on more of a goose chase than almost starting from scratch. So bad or outdated information wouldn't be super helpful. And so having a idea or making it a point to, most farms have maybe a 1 or 2 month period of time where it's a little bit slower on the farm and they're handling some administrative tasks. And so I thought about tax time is when we're handling some things related to the business. We're looking at some of this information anyway. So even, just taking a look at the plan, if everything is roughly the same and doesn't need to be updated, great. But, that might be a reminder for us to sit down and look at some of this other information as well, like when we are filing our taxes or doing something else in relation to the business. But if information changes frequently, or if something significant happened with the business and suddenly a lot of that information is no longer viable, then that might be a good chance to sit down and review it as well. But again, the whole goal is that it's almost like insurance, in that it's hopefully you never end up needing it or using it, but in the scenario that you do, it would be an invaluable resource for those folks that are trying to step in and continue these tasks and continue these roles. And hopefully it keeps other potential issues from emerging. So let's say in a scenario you have one person on the farm that is primarily tasked with handling the cattle for the operation, and so they are out for whatever reason. They, maybe they had a heart attack and they're in the hospital and that kind of thing. So we have that issue. But if they were the person that always handled the feed for the cattle, if they always made sure that they were in the correct pasture, that they were taken care of and they were checked on and that sort of thing, and nobody thinks to do that, or nobody has the know-how or the right information to be able to handle that, well, now possibly the animals are not being fed. Potentially there's a gate open and there's animals up and down the road and getting out and that sort of thing. So we've got the one issue of our business partner is is absent, but we just don't want it to turn into, say, 2 or 3 issues past that. And so hopefully there's much less time spent on trying to search and understand, what needs to be handled and what needs to be taken care of. And even in scenarios where it is a website that we need to get into, if you had to access that information and you have to go through some of the security and resetting accounts, that can be kind of a long and frustrating process. So again, having that on hand for people that might need to access it would hopefully save them a lot of time and frustration. You can and should have several copies, and so this can be used a number of different ways. It could be flash drives, it could be emailed or physical copies or located somewhere online. And related to that, some owners are okay, and some managers are okay to have most of the information online. So if a lot of what you do in relation to your business is already there, you may be comfortable with that. But there are certainly others that they would probably prefer to go more of the physical. I'm going to write this out by hand and then make a couple copies and share it out that way. So again, it's at the discretion of the farm and what they're most comfortable doing. And that's not to say it could even be a combination of some of those things. So some of the more critical information you may prefer just to write down, but some of the more basic information you say, yeah, I'll just go ahead and put this online and I'll share it through email or something like that. But having that master file, and then that is probably what you would update each year and then distribute copies to whoever would need it. And again, that's based on how you want to handle that as far as is it digital, is it physical, all those kinds of things. And there is going to be some critical information that's listed on these files. Some is basic, but some is very personal and very confidential. So things like passwords and things like Social Security numbers, possibly locations of valuables and things like that. So that's, yes, there is you might say a security concern with some of that. But in the scenario where a family member needs that information and is trying to find that information, I think it's important that it is listed somewhere. And just like we just mentioned, it's just because you want to communicate that information, you can decide how and who you share that with. So you might decide that you only want to write that down and have a physical copy and print it off and hand it to 2 or 3 people that are just family members because of the security, of the confidentiality of some of that. But I think that if a family member needs to access that information, it is pretty critical for them to be able to have that. It's going to save them a lot of time and effort, you might say, in trying to manage what might be going on. But there might be some other things that, while it's not critical, it would be additional information that would be good to have in there as well. So let's say the farm has several pieces of property that they manage. You might own some and you might rent some, but if there are several tracts that are being managed, having maps of that property and knowing exactly where the property lines are, for instance, or understanding where electrical lines are located and that sort of thing. Again, if someone or something needs to be taken care of out there, having that information on hand would be very useful. And it could be as simple as when you go to this property and when you try to access it, the lock is hard to get open. So simply turning the key pretty hard to the right that's just a sentence or something that you put in there as additional information for someone that, if they've never been out there, if they've never accessed that, then they might get out there with the key, try it. It doesn't seem to work. And so they're sort of scrambling around trying to figure out, is that the right key or where is the right key and that sort of thing. So just having, you can imagine in kind of an emergency scenario, people are going to be maybe a little on edge, a little out of their comfort zone anyway. So anything we can do to kind of help that situation or give them additional information like that, I think is pretty important too. As we mentioned, we don't want this to replace our long-term plans and our business planning and succession. I think it is a good segue into some of those things, and there are resources available through Clemson Agribusiness. There are several folks on the team that work in this area. I know Scott does, and I believe Adam Kandrovich and Steve Richards do as well. So it can be whoever you feel most comfortable with. It might be a lawyer and those kinds of things too, but we would encourage you to think of a long-term plan and speak with a trusted advisor in relation to those things as well. But I think the tools are relatively self-explanatory and want it to be something in a sense that you never have to use, but did feel like it was a valuable resource and a valuable tool, and so kind of wanted to share some information with you today about it. And if you start to look at some of these documents and you have more questions or would like further guidance, certainly reach out to us in Clemson Extension and Clemson Agribusiness, and we will give you as much help and information as we can. So that is kind of the end of the section that I have, and I will stop sharing my screen, and I will put some of those links in the chat in just a moment.
Does anybody have any questions for Kevin about the contingency plans and importance of them, or just any general questions? You can put those in the chat if you want, and we'll switch over and I'll share my screen and we'll do a little market update. Okay, so I just want to take a few minutes here at the end to kind of update what's happening in the commodity markets, primarily corn, soybeans, wheat, and cotton. I think last time I shared a similar screen here where we're talking about some of the disruptors that may be influencing commodity prices at this time. And without a doubt, you have to mention the Russia-Ukraine situation. I mean, we're approaching 2 months now since the invasion began back in February. And from what I read, there's really not an end in sight. A lot of changes. Ukraine has suffered quite a bit of infrastructure damage, and there are concerns that even though their wheat crop has been diminished because of the war, the damage to storage and other infrastructure is probably going to mean that Ukraine does not have enough storage capacity for the production that they do have. So as you listen to market reports and things, and we talk about wheat production or corn production in Ukraine, we may not have access to all of the production they report just because they won't be able to ship it out of the ports or even store it for the short term. So that's one of the things that's it's hard to know how it's going to impact us, but certainly going to have a big influence. And with that being said, this war is also causing global food shortages. I know the southern part of Africa is experiencing some drought, and they typically import from Russia or Ukraine. And so we're going to see more and more global food shortages. And it's just, we really don't have a solution at this point. We're just trying to find some band-aids to try to mitigate this. But it's going to continue to influence commodity prices for the next couple of months, for sure. When you look at fuel and fertilizer, hopefully we're getting to the end of where we're having to buy fertilizer. but the prices are still going up. Availability has certainly been difficult to find some of the ingredients. Lime in particular was scarce in parts of the Southeast. And without lime, it really hampers the productivity of the fertilizer as well. I'm going to show a slide in a minute of what natural or LP gas prices have done. And it doesn't actually show that they've doubled recently, but since last year, natural gas prices have certainly doubled. I was reading this morning that the natural gas stocks in the US are 20% lower than normal. And the demand is just really strong because with Russia out of play, not being able to export, natural gas has really taken off. We're probably going to see higher prices throughout the summer because of this strong demand. The higher price has just not cut usage of natural gas at this point. So that's going to be troubling, particularly as we get into harvest and have corn to dry, peanuts to dry, and some of those things. However, prices continue to increase. And at this point, we're still seeing probably better price improvement than we have seen input increases, but that's only going to be good if we produce an average crop and make our expected production in 2022. Shifting south, you go to South America, they're still suffering from drought. It's beginning now to have an impact on their second crop, particularly the corn, which is double crop corn is where Brazil and those countries get most of their corn production. They're just having doubts on the prospects for that second crop corn this year. They have fertilizer, but it's backed up in the port. I was reading that they have like 600 million tons of fertilizer in ships, but they can't unload because they don't have any storage capacity for the fertilizer within the port. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, if that's going to hamper their yields if they can't get fertilizer when they need it. And then coming back to the US, we did get a rate increase earlier this year. Prime rate is now 3.5%. And what I'm reading seems like likely that we're going to get another 0.5% increase in May. That's going to put us at 4%. I just did some quick math, and that's another $5,000 of interest expense on top of the 3.5% rate for every $1 million of operating money you might borrow. So interest rates are really going to play a factor in the profitability of our South Carolina farms this year. So here are those slides I was mentioning a few minutes ago. You can see that in South Carolina, our fertilizer prices continue to increase. I think when we did this update in March, we were probably looking at these February numbers. And since February, you can see that urea has gone from about $900 to over $1,000 a ton. That's only 2 months, and that's a pretty hefty increase. Phosphorus has also increased from about $900. It's just under $1,000 a ton as of the middle of March. And potash has kind of leveled off, but it's still $850. When you go back to this time last year, you can see where that doubling has occurred. It's just a different environment today than what we were looking at just a year ago. In North Carolina, the reported fuel costs are kind of tapering off. You can see this blue line is diesel fuel. And since the first of the year, it's pretty flat, around $3 or so a gallon. It's dropped off a little bit. That's not what you see when you drive up and down the interstate and look at diesel prices there. But that's what North Carolina Department of Ag is reporting. And then on the propane, LP gas, it's actually declined since first of the year also, or held steady. But again, it's quite a bit higher than it was a year ago, about doubled on both of those. So fuel prices are probably having a big impact because so much of what we do on the farm requires diesel fuel, whether it's getting the products and goods into the farm to use or shipping out our production. Energy is really going to be a key factor to watch as we go through the summer. But on a more positive note, when you look at the actual commodity prices, we'll start off with corn. Since the Ukraine-Russia tensions began back in late February, you can see that corn is just steadily, it was moving upward here until the end of March. And when USDA came out with much lower corn acres intended for 2022, since then, corn prices have really just taken a run higher. This is December 22 corn. And in South Carolina, that's at 747 is the futures price. I mean, if you add 50 cents for basis, and we're looking at an opportunity to have $8 corn in South Carolina for 2022. Cotton has done something very similar since the middle of March. It was trading around $1.02, which any other year would be fabulous, right? I mean, we just don't see cotton prices of $1 very often. But since then, it's rallied up to the $1.10 range and traded there for about a week. And then it started higher in April and has been as high as $1.24, $1.25. Again, this is December 22 cotton, and having the opportunity to lock it in at $1.20, $1.24 is just a really interesting opportunity. It'll be interesting to see how many of our producers take advantage of some of these. July wheat certainly took off when the invasion first started, got as high as 12.50 or so. Since then, it backed off. And then once the planting intentions were reported at the end of March, we've kind of had a small rally from about 10.25. Currently it's trading around 11.25. Hopefully in South Carolina, we've moved past some of the weather concerns from frost, although it doesn't feel like it this week. And hopefully, we're going to have a good wheat crop and have some good opportunities on the price there. The problem is the end users are just not wanting to pay $11. And so we're having to roll out to September and December to try to find homes for wheat. So even though the price is attractive, we're having trouble finding buyers at these prices. So that's a concern we have on how we want to move this wheat and at what price. That kind of leads me back to soybeans, and I put them last because really we haven't seen much trend in soybean prices going higher. Again, partly that's because the US produces, South America produces a little bit more soybeans than the US does. And with their harvest period being opposite of ours, soybean prices have more supply opportunities than maybe corn or cotton do. Since the planning intentions report, though, we have seen a rally from about a little over $14 to where it closed yesterday at just under $15.25 a bushel. That's $1. And so while it doesn't look impressive on the chart, you have to put in context that we're talking about $15 soybeans against the November 2022 crop. That's a really good pricing opportunity. And as I was writing my newsletter this morning, I was like, well, how good of an opportunity are these prices? So I went back and looked at some of the historical prices that have been available to these crops. And so I looked back at 1986 through 2022. That's what, 14, 30, like 36, 37 years of corn prices. Over that period of time, corn has been less than $5.39 a bushel 90% of the time. Okay. So if you were to sell corn in that period for $5.40, you were in the top 10 prices available for the last 36 years. Okay. If you jump over here to this last column, you can see that yesterday's close was $7.47. I'm not saying prices won't go higher. Someday they will go lower, but we have a chance to be in the top 10% of corn prices for a long time by selling some corn at today's market prices. So again, what I'm saying, as a producer, you should be looking at some pricing opportunities right now. If you compare the top 10 price from 2010 to 2019, it was $6.43. Today, we're $1 higher than that. If you look at a top 10 price from 2020 to 2022, we're at $5.80. We're nearly $1.50 higher than that today. So if you look at these other crops, it's the same scenario. Soybeans, $12.52 over the last 36 years. Today, about $2.50 higher at $15.21. December cotton, it's 84 cents as a top 10 price since 1986. We're at $1.21. That is almost 40 cents higher than the normal top 10% price. It's hard for me to say you should wait for better prices because these really look attractive. Same thing on wheat, $6.75 for the last 36 years. Currently, we're at $11. That's $4.30 higher than a top 10 price. So again, I just would caution people that, you know, the opportunities are here to start market. If you haven't started marketing, to lock in some attractive prices to help offset some of these high input prices that we're facing. It's not to say we need to do 100% of expected production, but it's probably time to get some production locked in for 2022. So with that, I'll just open it up if there's any questions about the markets. Be glad to answer some of those.
I'll just jump in real quick and say I put the resources into the chat, and hopefully you are able to get those from the chat. They were links on my end. I know sometimes as a participant, it shows up a little bit differently. So if you need links to that information, we can email it to you as well. And we're going to do a quick poll question here at the end, just following some of that information, just to say, following today's program, what is your level of knowledge related to these topics? And I think Scott had something else he wanted to mention.
I was just going to remind people, you know, that if you know of somebody in agriculture who is facing some stress, mental stress, financial stress, family stress of any type, we do have, in partnership with Farm Bureau and Sun EAP, we do have free counseling services available for farmers and farm families. You can call the number on the screen and you will talk with a trained mental health counselor who is hired by Sun EAP that would help provide counseling services to you or to somebody you know. If you have the need to call it, just make sure you mention South Carolina Agri Wellness, and you know the call will be free, and I think you can get up to 3 consultations you know, by using this reference. So again, we appreciate you all joining in with us again today. We'll be back next month on the third Wednesday, and we'll have some new topics and some new things that we will talk about for disrupting South Carolina agriculture.